Good morning. All right, if anybody's outside, come on in. We're about to get started. Good morning. I'm John Kelly with Tuscarawas County Economic Development Corporation, and got all my colleagues here and director. And hey, it's great to see everybody. We've got close to 100 people registered for this. I suspect that some of them probably got up and looked at the thermometer and said, I could watch the live stream from home. So I hope everybody had some breakfast. There's really good food out there. At least get some coffee. But thank you for coming. I do want to say welcome to those that are online. It's really cool this year. We've got a class from the OSU ATI over in Worcester. And the Farm Business Management class is watching the live stream this morning. And so welcome, students. Glad you can join us. I want to give Dean Bielski a moment to say welcome.
Welcome. No, I got a couple. You can't give me a microphone and get me off stage that fast. Welcome to campus. Is there anybody here that has never been to this campus before? Okay, so I'm not going to go through everything. You all know what we're doing. We're having a great spring. I mean, weather's been a little challenging. Enrollment's been solid, and of course, teaching classes is primarily what we do. But we have some people here that are dedicated to other endeavors as well. So I note that Bill Beisel is here, Director of Business and Community and Services, and also Leadership Tuscarawas. Paul Dykeshorn, of course, is our Director of Engineering Technology. He not only does that, but he is also out in the community working relationships with companies and corporations, many that do international business here in Tuscarawas County and beyond. And we have two new additions. Anybody here remember Carla Barker by any chance? Yeah. Okay, she was my assistant for 12 years. She retired. Ren Howard is here. Ren, would you stand up so people can know who you are? So if you need to make an appointment with me or anyone else, Ren's your person. And yes, she's the person you want to know. And then Steve Minnick retired this year as well. And Sarah Andrews is with us. She's the new vice dean, so she's second in charge here at the campus. And I just thought I would take a moment to introduce those folks because they are long-term folks in many cases here with the campus, some with newer faces and new job responsibilities, and they're all wonderful. So I want to welcome Michael again and thank him for coming. This is your either 12 or 13 for me. How many is it altogether? 19. Okay. And it gets, it's so interesting. It's one of my favorite activities or events all year long. And, you know, we'll learn about the economic and trade forecast. We'll learn about the Browns. I wanted to brag on my Bengals, but they weren't a heck of a lot better, so I can't do that this year. But thank each of you for coming and being part of this very important presentation.
Thank you, Dean. Well, the most important information I want to share with you today is restrooms. You can go to the left, you can go to the right, you can go straight out from the doorway. So there's restrooms in every direction. Want to recognize our sponsors and our breakfast sponsor. Thank you for feeding us. The ChemSpec people, the Morelands and crew. Would you stand up for a moment? Let's give them a thank. Come on, ChemSpec, everybody, stand up. There's a bunch of them. They've been coming to this for years and supporting the breakfast for the last 3 years, so really appreciate that. Our speaker sponsors, we have several. First Federal Community Bank, would you folks stand up? There's a few of you. All right, thank you very much. Huntington Bank, I saw Teresa here. Anybody from Huntington Bank? Stand up, thank you. Yoder Lumber, had several. Did you guys make it? They're from Holmes County, but several of them, hopefully they're watching online. But thank you, Yoder Lumber, for being a sponsor. And then Allied Machine and Engineering. Do we have anybody from Allied? Stand up, please. All right, thank you. Okay. Also want to thank Kent State and our team Tuscarawas. A lot of companies have told me the past couple of years have been a bit chaotic, up and down, some good, some bad, but difficult to predict for their business. And that makes business harder when you're not quite sure what the future holds. And so we're grateful for Michael Weidokal coming on stage for the 19th time, 19 years in a row, to give us some signposts about what to expect in the coming year in the economy. If you've never heard Michael speak, you're in for a treat and a wild ride, I think. Is anybody here for the first time? Yeah, quite a few. Okay, anybody here that's been here like 15 times? Oh, wow, a bunch. All right, great. You've been here over 15 times? Yeah, give or take. All right, so in a few days, Punxsutawney Phil and Buckeye Chuck will be coaxed out of their burrows to look for the shadow and give us some indication about the future of winter. We all pray it's short. But I want to invite Michael Weidokal now to give us some indications about the future of the world economy, and glad you could be here. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. I don't think those groundhogs are going to make it through the snow. I don't. It was minus 11 when I parked my car. I think that's the coldest event we've had since I've been here. I've had to drive through some snowstorms to get here and barely made it a couple times, but this year, minus 11, I think we've broken a new record. So thank you for braving the cold and coming out. We have a lot to talk about. If you've seen my presentations before, you know that I tend to try to cover as much as possible within about an hour's time. There's a lot of information in this presentation, a lot of numbers, a lot of charts. Everyone will get a copy of the presentation, so don't worry if you miss a specific number or specific chart. And we have time for questions as well. So at the end of the presentation, we'll have some time if you have any questions. And I'll have my contact information as well in the presentation. If you're not connected with me on LinkedIn or something like that, I would encourage you also to connect with me on there. I post quite a bit of stuff, including some bad Browns jokes, which you should prepare yourself for. What are we going to talk about? Well, we're going to talk about where the economy is today, where the world is today. I've been doing this job for almost 25 years. This has probably been the most chaotic January that I can remember. The world is changing so fast, politically, economically, technologically, demographically, etc. It's really causing everybody's head to spin. So what I'm going to try and do is try and explain at least why the world is where it is today. What I want to do this year, and every year I have a different presentation, touch on different topics. This year I really want to focus on what are the threats and the opportunities facing your business or your community in a world that's changing this rapidly. So that's what I'm going to try to do next. We'll then look at some of the economic forecasts for the months and years ahead. We'll talk about how your community, how your business, how you as an individual can succeed in what is a dramatically changing world. And then, like I said, we'll have time for questions. This is just an example. This is from about 2 weeks ago. I read about 2 to 3 hours of news every day, which is pretty crazy, I'll admit. And this was I just thought I should copy the headlines that I've read in the last 30 minutes and just put them on a slide just to show you how much things are changing. I read these articles in, I don't know, a 20, 30-minute span, and then I probably went back to bed thinking I should not have gotten out of bed. But this is the kind of world we're living in. Information overload, change happening at a pace like we've never seen before. It makes it very difficult for communities and for businesses to formulate strategies. How are we going to move forward when you have such dramatic change? So the world today is clearly characterized by uncertainty. And this is what I hear no matter where in the world I speak, no matter what industry I'm speaking to, what type of community I'm speaking to. The one word I hear over and over again is uncertainty. We just don't know what's going on. How are we supposed to make a 2- and 3-year business plan? How are we supposed to make a community financial plan in a world with so much uncertainty? Another thing we're going to talk about, you'll hear this repeated a couple times, is concentrated growth. Economic growth, business growth, very concentrated right now in a handful of countries, a handful of industries. It's very consumer and tech-driven growth, especially here in the United States. Consumers and AI are our big drivers of growth, and they've been for the last couple of years. And then, of course, there's a lot of risk in the world today, and we'll talk about a lot of those as we go forward. This is one of the few charts that's been there for 19 years in some form or another. This one has been there since the beginning, since that little office in Dover that we started in the Economic Development Corporate. I think there were 10 people there at the first one. This is global economic growth by year over the last 10 years. And you can see that before COVID and after COVID looks pretty similar. We were growing as a world about 3.5% per year before COVID. We had COVID, of course, a big recession. We had a bounce back in 2021, and look what happened. We got back to where we were before COVID. Global growth right around 3.5%, but there's a big difference. This growth after COVID is far more concentrated in a small number of countries and a small number of industries than it was before COVID. That's very evident here in the United States. Same chart, but this is US economic growth. We were growing by almost 3% per year in 2023 and 2024. We're looking at roughly about 2.2% for this year. We grew 4.4% in the third quarter, remember. The fourth quarter predictions are all over the place. You'll see some economists forecasting 5% growth in the fourth quarter. You'll see some economists predicting no growth in the fourth quarter. There's a lot of uncertainty. And again, what played a big role in that? The government shutdown. We're lacking a lot of data for the fourth quarter. So the consensus, and we're right about the consensus here, is that the US economy grew by 2.2% last year, roughly. And that's a lot better performance than we were predicting 12 months ago. About 50% of economists were predicting a recession in the United States in 2025 at this time. That didn't come to be. We had clearly a very bad first quarter because of tariffs. We saw what tariffs did to a number of sectors of the economy early on. There was a great deal of uncertainty. I was hearing over and over again, particularly from manufacturing companies, can we just have some clarity on tariffs? If you're going to impose tariffs, just impose them and let us plan around them. But that's not the case, and we've seen more tariffs being imposed of late. Our closest competitor or rival, if you will, in terms of the economy is the European Union, and you can see the European economy has been doing significantly poorer than the US economy in recent years, growing by less than half the pace of the US in recent years. In fact, Germany just announced that they grew by 0.2% last year, and they were happy about that because that was the first time they've grown since 2022. The other big European economies also not generating very much growth in recent years. So if you look at this chart here, it shows this is average annual economic growth since COVID for the world's larger, rich countries. And you can see who's on top. It's the United States. So it's been a big advantage for US companies who primarily serve the US market in recent years. As you compare, the US 2.4% growth per year, Europe about 1%, Japan even slower, as you can see. So there's been some big discrepancies in terms of performance among the world's rich economies. What about emerging markets? China grew by 5% last year, which was exactly their government's target rate. I don't know how they managed to keep doing that. They always nail it, but they grew by 5%. The government said, we want 5% growth this year, and sure enough, they did it again. Remarkable. But the story in China, and there's a big story coming out of China, is that it's not Chinese consumers that are driving this growth. China's consumer market is extremely weak right now. Consumers in China are very, very much lacking confidence. There are huge amounts of debt in the real estate and construction sectors in China right now. So what is China doing? It's exporting its way to growth. And what did we do as a country last year? We imposed tariffs on China. And Chinese trade to the US declined last year, but Chinese exports still grew substantially last year because they're exporting everywhere else. They're exporting to Latin America, they're exporting to Europe, they're exporting to Southeast Asia. The other big emerging market, of course, is India. Now, as you've heard in this presentation before, India now is the most populous country in the world. It has more people than China as of 2024. Nobody knows exactly how many people live in China or India, but both countries have a little more than 1.4 billion. India's economy growing by more than 7% last year. India trying to diversify their economy, investing more in high-tech sectors, investing more in manufacturing. Still, it's a relatively volatile economy. So if we look at that same chart we saw for the world's rich countries, and we look at emerging economies, it's the same story we've been talking about for 19 years. It's Asia. Asia is where the growth is. The Asian economy is growing rapidly. Demand for manufactured goods, agricultural products in Asia is growing substantially, and their economies are growing, in general, faster than the world's emerging markets. You hear the story of it's an emerging market revolution. In fact, it's more of an Asian revolution. Now, you've seen this chart before. I brought it back this year because I think it is worth mentioning. Again, the world's rich countries, which is that bar on the left. I'm colorblind, and I should really know what colors I make my charts, but I think it's some form of blue. The lighter color, whatever that may be, those are the world's rich countries, and that's their average rate of growth by decade. And you can see, you've heard me make this analogy before. If your grandfather had a company, the markets he was working in, the US, Europe, Japan, were growing 4% per year. If your mother took over the business in 1980, those markets were growing 3% per year. And if you took over the business in the 21st century, those markets are growing less than 2% per year. So where do you find the growth? You had to go to emerging markets. You had to go to Asia if you wanted to keep growing at the same pace you were growing at in the past. This is for farmers here in the United States. Where did they continue to grow? The export markets, huge populations in Asia. Again, 1.4 billion people in India, 1.4 billion people in China, 680 million people in Southeast Asia. Those are vast numbers of people, and that's where that growth has been coming from. We've been talking about this, again, also for 19 years, labor shortages, and we'll talk about why that is, of course, but unemployment rates, even amid all this turmoil and even amid these technological changes, which we're going to talk about later, unemployment rates, if you see there, look pretty low. And so there's a problem we have. We both have a problem of a lack of labor, available labor for employers. At the same time, a skills mismatch. And this is what we're hearing more and more, that yes, we can find some workers, but they don't have the skills we need in the 2020s to move forward. And we'll talk about that as well going forward. A big issue has been inflation. And not just inflation, but really cost of living related inflation. A lot of the public anger you see, and we see it here in the United States, and we see it all around the world, is coming particularly from younger people who are finding it increasingly hard to live the type of life their parents and grandparents lived. Look at housing prices. Even though housing prices came down last year by almost 10%, they're still significantly higher than where they were. Housing prices have grown much faster than wages. That's just one example. Food prices. If you've been to the supermarket recently, if you've braved the cold and managed to stock up on food before the shelves were emptied, you know that prices have also gone significantly upwards. So while inflation is not as high as it was a few years ago, cost of living related inflation remains quite high, and that's a significant concern. The one exception, of course, there's China. China's dealing with deflation, which is what Japan dealt with for 30 years. That's even worse. For an economy at least, when prices go down and continually go down and shrink year after year, because increasing numbers of businesses and consumers wait. They're like, why should we buy this now? In 2 years, it's going to be cheaper. And that has, you can imagine the effects that has on the economy. So with inflation slowly coming down, but not coming down as fast as central banks would want, what have they done? They've slowed down the pace of interest rate cuts. In 2024, we saw a series of them, and then in 2025, central banks were like, no, we have to wait. Inflation's, it's not coming down fast enough. We're seeing political pressure now. We see it here in the US on the Fed. Of course, we're going to have a new Fed chairman at some point later this year. How that relationship works is very key. The lack of confidence right now in the ability of the Fed to maintain its independence is playing a very big role in the decline of the dollar. I don't know if you've been, if you're obviously you're trading, you know what the dollar has done over the last, let's say from 2014 to 2024, the dollar was incredibly strong, which was one of the longest periods of dollar strength we've had in US economic history. Since 2025, the dollar has fallen sharply, and we've seen that depreciation accelerate this year. It's good news for exporters, unless your export markets are blocked, which we'll talk about. But it's a challenge. Again, for an inflation standpoint, it's a challenge. For the central bank's decisions on interest rates, it's a challenge. And so we'll watch going forward what goes on there. The big issue, and again, all of our governments keep ignoring this one, are debts and deficits. They just keep going up and up and up. And both Republicans and Democrats are ignoring this issue at their own peril. This is not going to change anytime soon. This chart just shows public sector debt as a share of GDP. And of course, in the United States, we're close to 130%. Our public debt is about 38 trillion. Our economy is 31 trillion. We're paying $7 trillion a year, and that's our federal expenditures. And right now, almost $1 trillion of that is going to interest to pay off this debt. That's a lot. So that's something to keep in mind. We'll touch on that a little bit later. We talked a lot last year at this time about global trade. Tariffs were being put in place. We've seen tariffs continue to be put in place. We had new tariff threats. Let's see, South Korea was threatened with a 25% tariff last week. Canada with a 100% tariff. This is the world we live in. And it's really hard to keep up with what's going on in terms of tariffs, where the exceptions lie, where they don't. It's having a big impact on global trade. We are seeing a shift in global trade patterns because of these tariffs. And right now, it's basically the US and its partners. But we're worried that what is now a trade dispute between the US and its partners will become a global trade war. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Foreign investment. The big efforts right now are to bring foreign investment into the United States, and other countries are doing something similar. And we've been quite successful at that. That shows foreign investment over the last 10 years. We've attracted $3 trillion of foreign investment into the United States. So more than double China and far more than any other country in the world. Why is that? Well, if you're a business in Europe or Asia and you see there's 350 million pretty wealthy consumers over there who don't save their money, you really want to have your products and services in that market, right? Because it is the market still. Chinese consumers, as you saw, aren't spending. European consumers aren't spending much right now. Who's spending? US consumers. So if your business is trying to grow and you're not from the US, you want to be here. And so businesses, no matter what the political climate is, still see this as a key market for their future growth. One sector I wanted to touch upon a little bit is the agricultural sector. Now, this is a real opportunity. We talk about that growth. Where is it coming from? It's coming from big, giant, emerging markets that don't really have the capacity to feed themselves, right? This is a tremendous opportunity. We have some of the best agricultural land here in Ohio and here in the world, if you look at it from a global standpoint. And exports of agricultural products have soared around the world in recent years. But look what's happened over the last 12, 13 months. We've lost out on some real agricultural exporting opportunities, particularly with China. And who's winning? How about the South Americans? They've signed some huge trade deals of late. They did the Mercosur trade group, which is the 4 southern South American countries, so Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay, just signed a free trade agreement with the European Union. We've seen exports of agricultural products from Brazil and Argentina soaring to China and other Asian markets. And their agricultural sector is booming at the moment, which has given those economies, which haven't done very well, a pretty big lifeline. In turn, our agricultural sector has been dealing not only with the tariff situation, but with labor shortages. This is a real issue as we look at what's happening in our demographic situation here. Not only is our birth rate declining and is there emigration from rural areas of this country, but suddenly a big source of labor has been cut out over the last 12 months. And so this has been a real own goal. And I've spoken in many agricultural areas around the country over the past year, and that's the same message I've heard as well. Lost opportunity. We need to get this opportunity back. This is one of our sectors, and you'll see later just how this sector is performing compared to others. This is a sector of our economy that should be growing a lot faster than it is. Tourism sector, this is another one. It's our 250th anniversary this year. There was a lot of hope that that will bring in some big tourism dollars to certain parts of the country. We also have the FIFA World Cup coming to the United States this summer. It'll be the biggest one ever with 48 countries taking part. It's a real opportunity for our tourism sector. Another growth sector. This is one of those sectors of the economy around the world that's growing at a pretty rapid pace, growing faster than the economic average. But there's a lot of uncertainty right now. How many foreign tourists will be coming to the United States when they're watching the news, what's happening in Minnesota and elsewhere? Other countries investing huge amounts of money in their infrastructure for tourism. So this is a real challenge as well. It's an opportunity. This is a year that we really expect the tourism sector to do well, but it's facing some significant challenges, and it's not just the minus 11-degree weather outside today either. I spoke once in New York City to their tourism board, and they said in January, the #1 item they sell are winter coats because South American tourists come to Brazil not knowing how cold New York is in January, and they all have to buy bigger coats than what they brought with them. So they have amazing coat sales in the month of January. Politics, we know what's going on politically. We are living in an extremely volatile time right now. Political polarization and fragmentation is worse than it's been in decades in this country, not just in this country, but around the world. A lot of the trends we see here are also taking place elsewhere. Now, of course, because we're the United States, it's magnified. We see the whole world is watching what's happening here, but it is a concern. One of the big concerns I have, of course, is misinformation. I've had a number of articles in the Plain Dealer up in Cleveland over the last couple of years on my concerns about what misinformation means for politics in this country. Any of you who are surfing the internet right now or scrolling through TikTok or Instagram know what I'm talking about. And it's getting harder to find out just what's right, what's real, and what's not. And there's some technological experts who really believe that within a couple of years, the internet may be unusable because of AI-generated what they call slop, like misinformation, that people will really struggle to find what's right and what's wrong, and what's real and what's not. I may even be replaced by AI up here in a couple of years, and you won't even know it's me or not me. External politics. Now, you were laughing last year when I had Greenland as a risk, and I was right. Yeah, see? It was the first time I had talked about Greenland, and sure enough, what pops up? Greenland. And it's not just Greenland. There are a plethora of potential threats to the world right now. First of all, Latin America. We saw what happened in Venezuela a few weeks ago, where Nicolas Maduro, no one should mourn Nicolas Maduro. He's one of the most incompetent presidents ever to hold office in the Western Hemisphere, and that's saying something. But it's a dramatic change in the relationship. There's a clear move by the Trump administration to bring back the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, which means the U.S. will basically control affairs of the Western Hemisphere and not allow any non-Western Hemisphere country to have an influence in the region. So there's a lot of potential for more action in this area in the coming months. We still don't know what's going to happen in Venezuela. They, of course, have these big oil reserves. It's very dirty oil, and it's very expensive to bring out of the ground. You've heard the U.S. oil industry express not much interest, besides Chevron, who are already there. The rest of the oil industry is kind of lukewarm to investing in Venezuela. And there's a lot of other flashpoints there as well. Watch the Panama Canal. Watch what happens in Mexico with regards to the drug cartels. There's Greenland again. We talked about that. This has really driven a wedge into the Western alliance, perhaps a permanent wedge. And this was slowly coming. We've seen the drifting apart of the US and Europe over time, but this is a real breaking point moment. Europe still is dependent upon the US for its security, its defense. It underinvested in defense for so long that its security abilities or defense abilities are quite limited still. But it is a serious shift in geopolitics. Ukraine, we've been talking about this for over 4 years now, almost 4 years now. The war in Ukraine has now gone on longer than the war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in World War II, and it shows no end in sight. There is no end in sight at the moment. There are negotiations going on, but nothing is happening except people continuing to die in eastern and southern Ukraine. And most of that country who experience a winter like we're experiencing today are without electricity and without heat because of continued Russian drone and missile attacks on their energy infrastructure. The big one right now, the one everyone's watching, is Iran. We have been gathering a flotilla, which looks very much like the flotilla that was off the coast of Venezuela not long ago, or last year in Iran when we joined Israel's war against Iran to bomb their nuclear facilities. There are a lot of US naval ships now in the waters near Iran. There could be a strike in the coming days. You've probably seen it in the news. There were major protests in Iran recently, and those protests were driven by young people who were upset about the economic situation in Iran, the cost of living in Iran, about the clerical rulers in Iran. The crackdown killed anywhere between 5,000 and 30,000 people. It was a brutal repression of these protests by the increasingly decrepit regime that continues to rule Iran. So there could be military action here in the coming days, and that's why oil prices have gone up. You'll notice your gas prices starting to tick up again. It's because of this. And should there be a significant attack on Iran's oil facilities, you'll see oil prices and then subsequently your gas prices go up significantly. And then finally, the most important flashpoint, the one we always talk about, the most important one in our world, the US and China, the two great powers in the world today. There are a number of threats to security here. China is building up its ability to one day invade Taiwan, which you see there in yellow. It has disputes with India, it has disputes with Japan, it has disputes over the South China Sea. The relationship between the US and China, economically, politically, socially, is what will define the 21st century. I put these charts in to show what we're doing well in the US and what we're not doing well. And I compare us in these two charts to the European Union. It's the closest thing we have, it's the closest thing we can compare ourselves to. It's like comparing the Browns to the local high school team. They're probably about the same level. Sorry. But it is, it to show what we're doing well and what we're not doing well. And the first chart shows a lot of things we're doing quite well. And in the United States, we do the top line things really well. You look at our economic growth, you look at our salaries, you look at our overall economy. It's significantly stronger than Europe, and the gap has been widening. The US has been growing twice as fast as Europe in the 21st century. We have more Nobel Prize winners, more top universities, a stronger defensive ability. We've done these things very well, and that's why our top line numbers continue. And for 19 years I've been doing this. I think 16 or 17 of those years, the US economy grew faster than the European economy. It's a pretty good record. The things we're not doing well, though, as well, and a lot of those come in quality of life and health-related issues. We live 3 years less on average than the average European. That's 3 years of life we have less. We are less healthy than the average European, and we spend almost double on our health care as they do, and yet we live 3 years less than they do. Wealth inequality is high. We have more rich people. It's easier to become wealthy in the United States, but it's also easier to be poorer in the United States. We have a higher homicide rate, et cetera. These are things that we kind of know. So things we do well, like I said, economically, top line, we've been really nailing this so far. Hopefully we continue to. But on the other end, there's more that we can do for our population. So in summary, that's the world where we are now. The economy's bounced back from COVID. Again, COVID disruptions, do not underestimate how big those were and the impact they had on inflation and all these other things. COVID impacted the economy in much the same way a world war would do. That's how big of an impact it was. And we've recovered from that. But the growth has been more concentrated, and we'll talk about that going forward. Few countries, a few industries driving growth. And you see, risk is pretty high. So how do you, as an organization, or an individual, or a business, or community, how do you succeed? Because the world is changing faster than ever before. Well, you identify threats, and we're going to do that in a second. What are the threats facing your business, your individual financial well-being, your community's well-being? What are the opportunities for growth for your community, your business, your individual career, your financial health? You have to accumulate the resources you need to mitigate those threats and to grow, and you need a comprehensive plan. Let's get into some of the threats, because there's a number of threats. And it's important to mitigate them, right? Like this Browns fan here. What is he doing there, right? I imagine in 1999, he's like, what a great investment. I'm going to buy season tickets for the Browns every year. I'm going to get to see all these playoff games and Super Bowls. And 26 years later, and all that money spent, and one playoff win, right? Yeah, that's it. Not much. So identifying threats. He should have known the Browns were going to be terrible, right? I know the Bengals fans out here would agree. A big one is political uncertainty. And look, I'm insulting everybody here. They're both sleeping in these pictures. My favorite comedians are those who can go on stage and get everybody at one point. Everyone's like, oh, this guy. So that's what I try to do. I'm a political centrist, so that's where I'm coming from. But this is really a big threat. I'm hearing this over and over again, that businesses, communities are just, it's becoming more difficult when politics is not stable, when politics is the source of uncertainty. It's always been a source of uncertainty to some degree, but never as much as we've seen over the last 10 or 12 years. And that's a real concern. And it's causing real consternation is what is the future of our democracy? When you look at polls and people are not sure that democracy is the best form of government anymore, you have to start to wonder. And that's what we're seeing. And it's not just internal, it's also external. We've touched upon that already. We're dealing with both internal political risk, and not just us. I say us because we're here in the United States, but if I'm doing this presentation in the UK, if I'm doing this presentation in Thailand, it's the same. They're dealing with these same issues in their own way, their own internal risk, their own external risk. And you have to understand what are the impacts upon me. Businesses now are investing more than ever before in political and geopolitical research because they need to know what could happen and what is this going to mean for our business over the next months, the coming months and the coming years. Misinformation. We've talked about this. The spread of misinformation is a real concern because, of course, the amount of information we have is a real opportunity, which we'll talk about. But if we don't identify what's real and what's not, that's a big concern. It's impacting our politics, it's impacting your business decision-making, it's impacting your investing, your career, whatever it may be. So identifying misinformation is incredibly important. The only way to really do it is to have everyone be as well educated as possible. But as we know, it's difficult. We see what's happening, especially among our young people. We talked about the threat of slower growth in key markets. Those businesses 25 years ago that were selling their products or services to an industry or a market that wasn't growing have suffered accordingly, right? And those that identified the growth markets, they've had a very successful 21st century. The threat of concentrated growth. Now, we're pretty lucky. This chart shows the contribution to global growth by country, and who's on top? It's the US. The US economy has added almost 1/3 of the additional global economic output over the last decade. So it's been a real boom for US businesses. That's why our stock market looks like it does. That's why many of our businesses' financial health looks like it does, because their home market has been growing. But imagine you're not from here, and your home market's been growing significantly slower. This concentrated growth is leading to a serious threat of a bubble bursting at some point. And there are 3 bubbles that us economists are watching. The first one you've heard all about, it's the AI bubble. There's been so much investment in AI that if the returns on that investment are not what the investors expected, there is a real risk of a bubble bursting. And this is happening in 2 ways. One, it's the AI companies themselves who've received huge amounts of investment. But even more importantly, it's the infrastructure around AI. Look at all the investment that we've seen in data centers, in energy connected to AI in recent years. If there's not a return on that investment, this bubble could burst. I spoke recently in Phoenix to a lighting industry conference, and they said, look, our industry would be in decline right now if it weren't for data centers and mega projects like the Brown Stadium in Brook Park, and retirement homes. Those were the 3 things that were providing them growth. Everything else was in decline at the moment. The second bubble, and it's the one that's probably most at risk of bursting, and it's the least impactful, but the most at risk of bursting, is the crypto bubble. We've seen crypto prices already, they're incredibly volatile. There's a lot of risk here. I've always argued that until a central bank gets behind some form of crypto, that it's somewhat of a bubble risk. We're seeing that right now. And then the third one is debt. And we talked about the debt bubble already on the public sector. There's a lot of private sector potential debt bubbles bursting as well. And so what's that chart I put up there? That was the first bubble in our economic history that we know of. It's called the Dutch tulip mania. In the 1620s and 1630s, tulips come from Sri Lanka, and they were traded to Europe by the Ottoman Empire. They would come through Amsterdam, which was the major port for Europe at that point. And there was a huge demand for them. Such a demand that at one point, the price of one tulip future, the promise of you receiving one tulip, cost more than your house. And people were gladly paying it because everybody had to have a tulip. It was a status symbol. That lasted for a couple of years. And then people realized this is just a tulip. And you see what happened to the price. And it bankrupted some of the richest families and richest businesses in the Netherlands at that point. So this is a lesson to learn for how bubbles can be created, sometimes irrationally, and what their effects could be thereafter. We talked about the threat of inflation facing your business and cost of living concerns. That chart is hard to read. It's something that's rising incredibly fast and is incredibly worthless. It's the average price of Browns tickets from 1950 through to today. And you can see what's happened. So you hear this story, well, they're not raising our prices, they're reducing the size of the product we buy. In this case, they're reducing the number of wins they give you, and they're still raising the price. But this is a real concern because this is what's driving a lot of anger in the world. Young people in particular are extremely frustrated that they're growing up at a time, not only, and we'll touch upon this later, is their career uncertain because of technological changes, but because their ability to start a family, start a life has been hampered by the high cost of living. Inflation, of course, rose after COVID. It peaked in 2022. There's a lot of fault that goes around. The government certainly bears some of the blame. It was also mostly COVID disruptions that caused it. Labor shortages, high input costs, et cetera, all these things. But as long as inflation doesn't come down further, we're going to see these disruptions continue. So this is something to watch as well. How long does inflation prove to be uncomfortable, and how long does it keep cost of living related inflation high? We talked about the threats to global trade. This you've all experienced if you're dealing with international markets. The average effective tariff rate in the United States right now is higher than it's been since 1934. It's roughly around 17 to 18%. The real effective tariff rate somewhere around 11%. We all grew up in a world where trade was basically free, or almost free. And now we're adjusting to a world where it's no longer free. And so if your business is importing components to your product that are built in China, Canada, South Korea, wherever it may be, you're finding your costs going up. Now, so far, businesses have borne the brunt of the cost of tariffs. But that can't last, and that's not going to last. And 2026 is going to be the year where consumers start to bear the brunt of the cost of tariffs. Are you anyone planning to shoot off fireworks this 4th of July? The cost of fireworks is going to go up 200%, at least. We don't make that here. It's all coming from China. So if you're planning a big celebration in the backyard with a lot of fireworks, it's going to be make sure the attendees might want to charge a fee for the people who show up. And the concern is this could spread. So we've seen the U.S. impose tariffs on most countries, most of its trading partners. China's a perfect example. So we imposed significant tariffs on China, higher tariffs on China than most other countries, and somehow still China ran a $1.2 trillion trade surplus last year. How's that possible? Well, first of all, we talked about Chinese consumers aren't spending, so imports didn't grow. But they're exporting everywhere else in the world. Exports went up to Europe. Exports went up to Southeast Asia. Exports went up to Latin America. So what are those regions doing now? They're looking at putting tariffs in place on China because they're concerned about their own industries. Canada, of course, has just reached a trade deal with China out of anger with the US. But Mexico just announced they're going to put, they announced a couple of months ago, they're going to put tariffs on Chinese automotive products, cars and automotive parts. European governments are looking at protecting their automotive industry against the Chinese car industry. So this could become a much bigger global trade war, and once that happens, it's going to be a long time before tariffs come down. If it's just the US and its partners, this could be a short-lived trade dispute. If this becomes a global trade war, this could be our reality for some significant amount of time. We talked about rising debt levels. As I mentioned, our government spends $7 trillion a year, our federal government, $1 trillion roughly on interest, $3 trillion on programs for people over the age of 65. The government recently announced they want to raise defense spending from roughly $1 trillion to $1.6 trillion. I don't know where all this money's coming from because we didn't get the cut. The Doge cuts were nothing near that. Tariffs at their best, tariffs at their very optimal money-raising ability could raise maybe $300 billion for the US economy. That's the most optimistic outlook, and that doesn't count some of the losses, of course. So we're just adding to the long-term debt, adding to the deficits. And this is happening not just in the US, it's happening around the world. We live in a system that's not sustainable financially, a public spending system. There has to be a reckoning at some point. But it's hard, right? You don't give the consumers a public service and take it away from them. You just don't do that. You can do it, you're not getting reelected if you do it. So it is a real concern. There's a real threat of being left behind technologically. We're all dealing with this, whether you're a student here at Kent State, whether it's your business, whether it's your community, whatever it is. Technology is changing faster than ever before. And our heads are spinning around it. And there's a lot of ways this is impacting us. If you're a community, you should be investing in technological training for your businesses and for your citizens. You want to have a population that's technologically savvy in this world. When it comes to attracting business and attracting investment, that is going to be a very key advantage you could have. If you're a business, you have to be adopting these technologies. You need to be becoming more productive through these technologies, because if you're not, some of your competitors certainly are. You may even have competitors you don't know about because technology is reducing the barriers to entry to your industry tremendously. So you could have new competitors that arise. And individuals, you see this yourselves in your career. Imagine you were a young person. Let's say you're in your last year here at Kent State, for example. The job market has changed so much from the time when you entered the university 4 years ago to now, that if you're not prepared for this new reality, you're at a very big disadvantage. Think about young lawyers, young accountants. What do they do when they get hired? They do the research work. They do all the support work for the partners, the heads of the firm. That support work's now being done by technology. So how do they get hired and move themselves up the ladder to become the future partners and the future bosses of their business? It's a challenge, and we don't know how that's going to play out. And a huge amount of well-paying jobs are going to be lost in this transformation. We've seen small numbers of it so far. We've seen some businesses announce AI and other technological-related layoffs. It's just the tip of the iceberg. It's very much just the tip of the iceberg. Another big thing is energy, resource and energy shortages. I'll focus on energy because energy has become the new competitive determinant for many regions. 10 years ago, it was labor force. If you had the workers in place, you could attract investment because that was the #1 concern that businesses had. Now it's, do you have the energy that we need for our data centers and for all the tech we have? So energy has increasingly become a competitive advantage or disadvantage. If you have plentiful, accessible, relatively cheap energy sources, you can attract a lot of investment in the modern world. Environmental, how can I talk about climate change on a -11 day? This cold air is being pushed down south by a high, by warm temperatures over the Arctic right now. So put that in mind. It's -11. I'm not even going to try. But it's changing the world. We saw what happened in Los Angeles last year. The changing climate, the changing environment that we live in is a threat to many businesses. It's also an opportunity for others. I've mentioned this before. Scientists call the Great Lakes region the most climate change resilient place on Earth. So if you're looking to attract investment and you're competing with Florida and Arizona, say, hey, if you avoid the odd tornado, you're really safe here. It's not going to be too hot or too cold. Don't bring them here in January. But it is a real opportunity for our region because more and more businesses are being told by their investors, you need to have a plan for sustainability when you're investing somewhere. And we can really sell this region of the country by saying, hey, we are the most climate change resilient place on Earth. Our population's also changing. We've talked about demographics for 19 years, and we see the labor shortages that are impacting the agricultural sector, the trucking sector, logistics, et cetera, becoming more and more acute. And why is it? Because people aren't having babies. You've heard this number from me before. The average, if you want your population to stay the same and nobody comes in and nobody comes out, the average woman has to have 2.1 babies in her lifetime. Our birth rate in the United States, 1.6. 1.62 if you want to be exact. In Ohio, it's 1.68, so we're not doing much better. Only one state, you've heard me say this before, South Dakota, they're at 2. They're the last state in the union to have 2 babies per woman. But our birth rate has been falling, so if we don't have immigration, which we've cut off immigration, as you've seen the numbers that have come out in recent days, you have to have more babies, or your population is going to shrink. And that's what's happening. And you see it happening in many ways. First of all, it's happening in the number of young people. We're at a university today. Universities are facing a huge challenge because the number of people under the age of 18 is falling sharply. In Northeast Ohio, it's forecast to decline by 10% in the coming years. In China, as you can see from that chart, it's going to shrink by 44% in 25 years. So if your business is education, if your business is the toy industry, whatever it may be, your market is disappearing and disappearing rapidly. And the birth rate is falling almost everywhere. Even India now has a birth rate below 2.1. China just released their birth rate figures from last year. It was the lowest birth rate since 1949 when their country was ending their civil war. South Korea has the world's lowest birth rate, 0.7. The average woman has 0.7 babies in South Korea. Even Italy, the land of love, right? You think they'd be having all these babies, 1 baby per person in their lifetime. This is happening everywhere, and this is changing the world. So it's leading to a dramatic decline in young people. It's leading to a decline as well now in the working age population. Now, the US has always had this big advantage that we could offset that because we were attracting immigration to fill a lot of those jobs. We're not anymore. At least for last year, we didn't. And that's going to be a real problem for many businesses, finding workers. And not everything can be automated. Not everything is, it's a lot of the jobs that are not being filled are those jobs that can't be replaced by technology, whether it's AI or automation or whatever it might be. So, of course, we're seeing the labor shortages that I mentioned. It's not just labor shortages, it's mismatched skills. The businesses that are looking to hire people often can't find people that have the skills that they need. And I hear this over and over from all different types of businesses, trucking businesses, agricultural businesses, et cetera. We can't find workers who fit our needs. I have a friend, he's the head of a paramedic operation in one of the cities up by Cleveland, and when he was hired, I think it was 20-some years ago, he was one of 200 people to apply for the position. He said they recently had a position available, 3 people applied. And that's happening everywhere. So you're not just not finding workers, it's hard to find quality workers with the skills that you need. So there's a lot of threats. That's kind of what I'm saying. There's a lot of threats, a lot of uncertainty, political, economic. Some of these are long-term that are going to stay in place for long-term. Others could prove to be short-term threats, some of the political stuff. We'll see how that turns out. But understanding these risks gives you the opportunity to put the resources in place you need to mitigate the threats to your business. You know labor shortages are coming. You want to be aggressive, going to universities and trying to get the available talent before it's taken by somebody else. You have to be more proactive to mitigate the threats, whether it's labor threats, economic threats, et cetera. Now, there's a number of opportunities as well out there. And it's a chaotic world, and that means there's a lot of threats, but it also means there's a lot of opportunities for growth. The Browns could win the Super Bowl, like that fake headline I put up there. That fake headline, not only did they win the Super Bowl, it was their 3rd straight Super Bowl that they won. And then I woke up, and they beat the Eagles 35-10, in case you can't read that, which, if you don't know your football history, the Browns were in a different league before they joined the NFL in 1950. They won that league 4 years in a row. Everyone in the NFL thought it was a terrible league. They played the Eagles in their first game in the NFL. The Eagles were the defending champs, and the Browns beat them 35-10. It's one of the most famous games in NFL history. So there's your football history lesson. That's the last positive thing I'm going to say about the Browns. It's important to seize the opportunities. It's important to understand the threats, but it's also important to seize the opportunities. If you understand the opportunities and what they are, you could gain a critical first mover advantage. You could be the first one into a new market. You could be the first one with a new product, and that gives you a real opportunity. But these opportunities are a little more concentrated in the past. You have to pick the right market. You have to pick the right industry. And if you fail to, obviously you'll be at a competitive disadvantage. The big one right now is through technology. Technology is really helping you to become more productive. It's helping you to offset some of these labor shortages. The labor shortages are coming. These demographic trends are not changing anytime soon. So how do you offset them? You invest in technology. It could be automation. Factory workers are hard to find. I hear this repeatedly from a lot of my manufacturing clients, that we just can't find workers. We're not investing enough in automation in this country. Believe me, if you go to a factory in China or a factory in South Korea right now, you see how automated one of those are compared to ours. You know that they knew these labor shortages were coming a long time before us, and they've been doing something about it. And here in the United States, we need to really pick up our game in terms of investing in automation, because labor shortages in that sector are going to worsen dramatically. Now, on let's say the office sector, also investment in AI. We're seeing companies increasingly invest. They don't really know what to do yet, though. This is what I'm seeing. It's very uneven, the investment in AI. Some businesses have gone all in. Other businesses are kind of taking a wait-and-see approach. There's no across-the-board plan to invest in that type of technology at the moment. But businesses are increasingly doing so, because also they're facing the threat of labor shortages. Now, the big opportunity, and this is the number one opportunity that is out there, is that technology can boost productivity. Because you've heard me speak before, if you've been here, that one of our biggest economic problems is that productivity growth has been declining for 40 or 50 years. It's been trending downwards over that time. Technology is starting perhaps to reverse that. That chart shows US productivity growth rates over the last few quarters. Those are pretty positive numbers. That's a real positive sign that, if your economy doesn't have, if your market is shrinking, your labor force is shrinking, trade and investment is uncertain, the only way you're going to grow is through productivity growth. And look, we are actually generating productivity growth. And this is generating a lot of that growth that we've seen in the US in recent years. So there's some real positive signs coming from the intersection between technology and productivity. We also have reduced barriers to entry and expansion. It's easier than ever before to start a new business. It's easier than ever before for an existing business to enter a new market, to create a new product. And technology is helping us do that. And in fact, we hear a lot of these tech leaders talk about eventually there's going to be a one-person, $1 billion company. Maybe one of you will start it. Maybe this will be the impetus. You'll start it right here today. I want a 10% stake in the business if that's the case, because I gave you the inspiration. But this is the kind of world we live in. There are opportunities, a lot of it technology-driven, to dramatically expand a business. Information availability, just like this baby investing in her stocks there, there's more information available than ever before. The analogy I like to use is that a young, let's say this baby here, has access to more information in 30 minutes than Thomas Jefferson had in his lifetime. And that's true. We have information overload almost. But one of the great hindrances to making strategic decisions, whether it's a community, whether it's a business, whether it's your own personal finances, has been a lack of information. That's not really a problem anymore. Information is everywhere. You can find out anything about anyone or any business or any potential client or any potential business partner that you want. And that's a real opportunity that just a generation ago would have been unimaginable. The spread of innovation and new ideas is happening faster than ever before. It's changes in demography, changes in communication, changes in technology. So the new ideas and new products, new services, the spread of them is happening dramatically fast. And then, of course, there is one growing market, and that's the over 65 market. We talked about the impact that the over 65 population is having on government finances, which is not good. But it's also the key growth market of the 2020s, 2030s, 2040s, 2050s. There are 830 million people in the world today over the age of 65. In 25 years, that'll double to 1.6 trillion. So here's your growth market. So if your business doesn't have products that serve consumers over the age of 65, you might want to think about expanding your product base. Because this is not only are the numbers here, but the wealth is here as well. An increasing amount of wealth is concentrated in the hands of people over the age of 65. A lot of that is in the form of property. A lot of that is the form of stocks. But there's a tremendous amount of wealth. And this population is growing all over the world. And choosing the right growth markets is important. I show this chart every year. Last few years I've been showing it. It's the average rate of economic growth by U.S. sector over the last 4 years. And you can see a lot of the traditional sectors have been growing slower than the U.S. economy as a whole. Remember, U.S. economy has grown 2.4% in this period. So anything above 2.4% is growing faster, anything below 2.4 slower. Government has shrunk, no construction growth. We see agriculture and manufacturing growing, but relatively slowly. Where's the growth coming from? The big one, of course, oil and gas, and you've experienced that right here in this region, fastest growing sector over the last few years. The information sector, again, the tech sector, no surprise there, and then professional services. And if your business has been operating in one of these sectors, your primary focus has been on these sectors, your opportunities for growth have been significantly greater than if you were just selling to the federal government, for example. And we've seen I have a number of clients who primarily work with the federal government, and they're all in serious financial distress at the moment. So picking the right sectors is extremely important, and identifying those sectors that are going to grow in the next few years is extremely important. And some of them are obvious. The tech sector still has room to grow. Obviously, there's a bubble risk as the investment in AI continues to grow, but no one expects the tech sector not to continue to expand. Any product or service aimed at people over the age of 65. So think about healthcare, specifically healthcare for people over the age of 65, a guaranteed growth market. There is no way that market is not going to grow for the next 10 or 20 years. Defense. We've talked about all this geopolitical risk, right? Well, obviously, the defense sector is going to benefit from that. It's not just the US that's increasing defense spending. It's almost every country in the world right now. And we've seen some big defense investments in the state of Ohio recently. And that's That's good news for us. That's an industry that is going to grow going forward. We're competing for investment. This is an opportunity for many businesses. Regions and states and counties and cities are competing increasingly with increasing, let's say, vigor, trying to attract investment. We'll give you these tax breaks. We'll give you this land, whatever it may be. That's a real opportunity as well. This competition for investment is going to intensify. I've already mentioned that if you have a favorable environmental situation, if you have the resources in place, you have a huge competitive advantage. And this is a region that absolutely fits that mold. This is a real opportunity for this region to attract investment. And I've worked with a number of different counties and regional leaders over the past year in particular, and this is really they talk about how many businesses are interested in coming to this region. Now, we need to overcome a number of challenges. Labor is a big one, and land availability in some parts. But this is a real opportunity. Businesses know that they have an environmental and resource advantage if they invest in this region. And stability is a competitive advantage. And when you're living in a world of chaos and rapid change, if you can offer some degree of political stability, economic stability, social stability, you have a competitive advantage. So that's very important to consider, not just your community, but your region as well. And competitiveness is the key to success. How competitive is your region against your neighbors in terms of attracting investment? How competitive is your business against your rivals within your industry? How competitive are you in the job market against people that might want the same new position that you want? All about competitiveness. So a lot of opportunities out there as well. A lot of them stemming, of course, from technology. If you don't understand technology, you need to understand it. It's as simple as going on YouTube, really. I mean, YouTube is the best university in the world these days, right? You can find out anything on YouTube. You need a recipe for that pasta you want to cook? Go on YouTube, right? You want to learn about AI? Go on YouTube, follow some courses. It really is, it sounds like I work for YouTube. I don't, but it really is an opportunity. So, and again, it's about making the right decisions. The career you have, is it in an industry that's going to give you growth opportunities? The business you have, is it in a market that's going to grow in the future? Your community, are the businesses coming here businesses that are going to offer long-term growth possibilities? So where is the economy going? We live at a time of demographic stagnation. We can't change that. Even if everyone went out and made babies today, it would have no impact on the economy for a long time. We live at a time of dramatic technological change. This is also going to continue for the foreseeable future. Productivity is the key. Can you do things? Can you do more with less? Can you do more with what you have than your competitors can do with what they have? And it's definitely widening the gap between the haves and the have-nots. Many of you have seen articles probably about the K-shaped economy, where the upper end of the consumer spectrum is growing much faster than the lower end, and this has been happening. This is also happening in the business sector. This is happening on a regional basis as well. Make sure you're on the upper end of that K. So we're expecting global economic growth to hold steady this year, 3.2%, which is where we predicted it would be last year, and then a small slowdown in the coming years. Obviously, if the bubble bursts, this will be a little bit overly optimistic, but we're pretty much in line, our forecast, with other major forecasters around the world. So it's pretty steady growth this year, and then a little bit of a slowdown. This demographic headwind is really going to start to impact more and more economies, especially, and you'll see why in a little bit. US also relatively stable growth, around 2.2%, and then a tiny bit of a slowdown. There's a lot of bubble risk in the US right now, though. The level of volatility in the US economy is higher than it's been since COVID, quite frankly. And this number can go up if the tech sector does even better than expected, like it did last year, and consumers keep spending. It could also go down if consumers stop spending. And there is a little bit of concern. We've seen some of the recent consumer confidence indicators that have come out in recent weeks. They're not very positive. And that's a little bit of a concern we have, because again, consumer spending, all important for the US economy. As far as Europe, relatively stable as well, between 1 and 1.2%, about half, a little bit more than half the growth rate in the United States. The big economies aren't growing. We're starting to see European governments spend more, which will boost growth a little bit. They're spending more on defense, of course, and on stimulating the economies there. But again, relatively sluggish growth. And that chart looks just like it did almost for the last 5 years. The US, 2.1% per year, a little bit slower than before. Europe, about 1% per year. Japan, a little bit lower. It looks very similar to what you've seen. As far as the Chinese economy, we're expecting a slowdown. It's already slowed in the fourth quarter. We saw 4.5% growth in the fourth quarter. We're expecting 4.3% next year. The demographic headwinds are big. China's population shrank by 3.4 million people last year. Imagine that, 3.4 million people. That's like all of Northeast Ohio and parts of Youngstown and whatnot gone. And that's happening year after year in China. So its growth is going to slow going forward. India is going to grow between 6 and 7% in the coming years, which means if we look at that overall, again, growth is still concentrated in Asia. We see some growth in Africa picking up. Africa is the only place where the population is growing significantly. Africa's population right now is about 1.5 billion. It'll be 2.5 billion by 2050, so it'll add almost 3 United States in 25 years. Just a staggering number, quite frankly. But it'll need more investment. It's going to have to create a lot of jobs. It's going to have a much bigger market. It's going to need to expand its infrastructure. But that bears watching going forward. Inflation, forecast to slowly come down. It's actually a forecast to go up in the coming months. We're expecting some of this tariff-related inflation to pick up in the coming months and then to start falling by the end of the year very, very slowly. And that's disappointing because we do need inflation to come down a little more, get this cost of living situation under control. Labor force, this shows Japan's just overall population. You can see how older Japan is coming. The average age in Japan, now Japan is ahead of all of us when it comes to demographics. Where Japan is now is where we're going. We'll be Japan in 20, 25 years. The average age in Japan is almost 50 now. The average person in Japan is almost 50. A huge share of the population is retired. The population is shrinking by 700,000 people every year. Population is, what, 126 million, so it's a significant drop. That's our future. That's especially a future if we don't have immigration, because Japan, of course, has very little immigration, and they have one of the world's lowest birth rates. We're headed there. Europe's headed there. Many of the major economies are headed there, and that's something we're not quite prepared for just yet. International trade and investment, we expect, again, trade barriers are going to remain in place. The U.S. is going to keep them in place, at least for the time being. It is possible that if inflation were to go up too much and the president's approval rating fell even further, that he might backtrack on some of these tariffs. We've seen he's very responsive to poll movements. The big reason why the U.S. backed off on Greenland was because only 20% of people in the U.S. supported annexing Greenland, and he knew that, so quickly backed off. If we see some pressure here, if cost of living issues remain a big problem for them, especially as the midterms approach and tariffs increasingly take a big share of the blame, there's a possibility he backs off on some of his tariffs. Debts and deficits obviously are going to go up. This chart here shows the projected U.S. federal debt, and these are official numbers, and you can see what's happening. It's growing dramatically. Even in the most optimistic scenario, debt will be 1.5 times the size of the U.S. economy by the year 2050. And that's the most optimistic scenario. There's going to be a reckoning at some point. This is not sustainable. We will at one point run into a place where we can no longer pay this. And there are many countries ahead of us in line. We're not the only ones here. We've seen this happen in Argentina, Pakistan, Bangladesh. But this is going to happen in the bigger economies in the coming years. There are a number of countries facing problems like this. Italy, France, for example. Japan has the world's highest debt. Their federal debt is about 230% of GDP now. It's mostly domestic owned, which makes it a little safer, but it's still a risk. And it's also private debt. If you take China's public plus private debt, all of their debt is 3 times the size of the Chinese economy. This is, again, unsustainable, especially in a world that's not growing faster. Internal politics, does anyone think politics are going to get neater? I don't. It's going to get messier. That chart shows the results of the recent parliamentary elections in the Netherlands. 15 different parties made it into the parliament. 15. I could have put the Austrian one up because they have a beer party that made it into the parliament. They have a few seats. The Party for Animals is here. There's a few others. But you can see that this shows the fragmentation. We don't have that here because we're generally a 2-party system, but just look at all the different groups within the Democratic and Republican parties here, very special interest groups. More and more voters are voting on a single issue that they care about, and that determines their entire voting life. Geopolitics likely also to remain pretty messy. in the coming years. Again, watch the US-China relationship. That's the big one. That's the one that's really going to determine our future going forward. So we're looking at slower economic growth, slightly slower in the coming years, and it's going to be generated by a relatively concentrated group of countries and industries. So make sure you have a presence in those. So how do you succeed? We talked about this, and this will be the last thing I talk about then. You identify the threats to your community, to your business, to your own individual well-being. You identify the opportunities for those same things. How can we grow in this changing world? You allocate the resources to deal with them. It's well and good that you know that these threats are coming. It's well and good you know you have this opportunity. If you don't have the resources to take advantage of them, it's all for naught. And develop a strategy to mitigate threats and take advantage of opportunities. I won't go through all these. You'll get a copy of that. I'm going to finish up here. Again, to conclude, dramatic changes around. I've been doing this, like I said, I started ISA in 2003. I was doing this before in the UK with PwC. I've never seen a world quite like this. The amount of change that's taking place now is greater than it's ever been. And I've lived through the financial crisis, COVID. I can remember speaking down here during the financial crisis. There were a lot of forlorn faces in the audience. I remember distinctly. During COVID, we had to do it online, of course. It was not as fun as being in place here today and driving through the minus 11-degree weather. But this is the world we live in right now is more chaotic than at any time in the 21st century. And businesses, individuals, communities are really struggling to keep up with these changes. But they do create opportunities. It's not just threats. There are threats. They're serious threats. But there are real opportunities to grow as well. And so understanding these changes gives you the insights you need to go and take advantage of these opportunities. And you have to be proactive. It's not about, this world isn't about sitting back and waiting anymore. Things are changing so fast, you have to be proactive. You learn about an opportunity, you have to act upon it. You learn about a technological change that's coming down the road. Get on top of it before it's on top of you. It's very important. So that's my contact information. Again, I would encourage everyone to connect with me on LinkedIn if you're not already, because I do post quite a lot on there. That's my email address if anybody wants to ask me questions after the event. But I think we have time now for some questions. I kept it more or less in an hour's time. You want the microphone?
Questions?
None. Great.
Gold just went above $5,000 an ounce. How do precious metals and rare earths figure into things?
Well, as long as the dollar, now normally in a situation like this, where all this volatility I talked about, the dollar would be soaring. But the Trump administration, both deliberately and not deliberately, is weakening the dollar. And so investors are scrambling, and there's no other currency alternative to the dollar. The euro's not it, the Swiss franc's too small, the yen's, you see what's happened to the yen. Precious metal has become that alternative. So as long as we live in a world with a high degree of uncertainty, a dollar that's depreciating, gold and silver are going to go up. So there's much more room for growth there as long as this situation continues. And the Trump administration has been very blatant. He's happy to see the dollar get weaker. So if that's the case, gold is your number one investment opportunity if you're looking for a safe haven investment.
So earlier you had a couple of slides that were comparing the US and the EU through a couple economic indicators. And on the first slide, you talked about the per capita GDP as well as the average salary.
Yes.
And then on the second slide, you talked about how there's a larger wage disparity here than in the EU.
Yes.
Do you ever look at the median salary of countries?
There's some studies for median salaries, but they're really poorly done. So UBS does the main one, and it's just not as thorough. Some of the numbers are really questionable because I've actually done some deep dives into that. So there is some numbers out there, and clearly when you look at it from a median perspective, that gap shrinks because we have a lot of high salaries here that are far in excess of high salaries in Europe. So that does shrink. So the medium gap between the United States on wages over Europe is not as big as it is in the just simple average gap, for sure. But there's not a really good median study. Like I said, UBS has the one that's kind of cited by most economists, but it's it's a pretty poorly done one, and it hasn't been updated in a while.
You touched on AI, and I know a lot of the coverage is about more kind of generalist, what is this going to mean, but some of the more specialized areas, coding, protein folding, drug molecule discovery, the advances even the last couple months have been pretty amazing.
Yeah.
I guess I wonder, have you seen sectors in some of these areas that are starting to reinvent themselves around these applications, and does that give it any indication of what more broadly the impacts could be in the next couple of years?
They haven't really yet, but we're on the cusp of it, like you said. I mean, the coding, I mean, you've seen the changes in the coding sector, especially in the labor side, just how that has collapsed. Like the number of new coding jobs and people studying coding has fallen dramatically. And I think, like you said, it's a good point. In some of the research areas, pharmaceuticals, other science, a lot of this is going to be technologically driven going forward, and that's going to transform complete industries. I had a chart, it might have been last year or 2 years ago, that talked about how technology is not going to be driven by humans in the future. It's going to be driven by AI and other technologies, and that's going to accelerate the pace dramatically, but it's also somewhat frightening. So it is going to transform a number of industries, particularly on the research end, pharmaceuticals, a lot of scientific ones. But again, I don't think we're just on the tip of the iceberg there at the moment. But some of that productivity growth we're seeing as well is a result of that. That you're seeing processes, whether it's a research process developing new drugs, whether it's a manufacturing process, being now completely technology driven. And my understanding, and I speak at a lot of different conferences and where actual experts on AI speak, is they say, especially for many people here, once agentic AI becomes really widespread and adapted, that's where we're going to see the real change. That right now it's still, we're using it almost like a search engine or an encyclopedia. Once agentic AI is up and fully running and you've given it its tasks and it's off and running, that's where we're going to see the change. But I'm not an expert in that. I can only speak on its economic impact there.
Well, I see the president has announced a new Fed chair.
Has he?
Yeah.
This morning?
Yeah, Kevin Warsh.
Okay.
So I don't know if that means anything. But the other question I have, we had a relatively, I think I'll ask this question, Marshall looking at me, but we had a relatively large investment announced in our county by a company which was going to be around electric vehicles. So I mean, that may be a little more segment specific than you normally talk about, but where do you think electric vehicle is going to go? And then going back to that chart, where the heck are we going to get that electricity for all those data centers and the electric vehicles without something different than we're doing today?
There's a lot of questions. Well, the EV, it's very interesting, the EV sector, because we've kind of, in the US, we've had this like turn against EVs in a way. But if you look at the numbers outside of the US, EV sales are booming. And it's being led by China. China is absolutely taking over the industry. I've been in Europe many times over the past years. If you rent a car, there's a real good chance now it's a Chinese car. And that they've taken that sector over. And we're kind of in a bubble here in the US when it comes to EVs. So where that leads in the future is uncertain. But everywhere else in the world, EV adoption is rising dramatically. Now, a day like today is not a good day to advertise EVs because their minus 11-degree performance is not as good. But that sector is going to continue to grow, and you're seeing countries invest huge amounts of money in the EV charging infrastructure. As far as energy, and that's the great question, and I think that is the big question for economic developers over the next 5 or 10 years, where are we going to get the energy? Because I've talked to many, even in this state, and they say we've had to turn away many projects because we've already allocated the electricity, especially in areas where data centers are nearby, or the Intel investment down in Licking County. I know the surrounding counties have suffered from a lack of electricity. So that's going to be a massive challenge. And you see the private sector is now, there's a lot of concern in the private sector, and that's why you see this talk of these mini nuclear reactors that Google's talking about. You saw Siemens announce this fusion energy project a couple days ago. There's a lot. The private sector is looking at alternatives for their own way to generate electricity because it is the #1 competitive determinant right now. And our situation here still is relatively favorable compared to many other states. But of course, we are now, what are we, #3 in data centers, I think. As far as states, we're #3 in the terms of number of data centers that we have. So obviously, that's a major drain on our electricity resources. I'm up in Cleveland. That big IX center next to the airport is going to be turned into a data center. You're going to have the Factory of Sadness, the Brown Stadium, and then you're going to have the data center factory right next door to it, next to the airport. So I just saw that opportunity and ran with it.
When you talked about the agricultural economy, the theme was basically lost opportunity. But given the markets, the demographics, what are the opportunities, the crops and commodities and things that farmers in Ohio should be planning ahead for?
Well, you're going to see continued demand over the near term in Asia. So soybeans, of course, has been a real opportunity, and Ohio's taken advantage of that. Africa going forward, Africa's population is going to grow by 2.5 billion, or it's going to grow to 2.5 billion. Most African land is very poor for agriculture. There's going to be a huge long-term demand for agricultural imports in Africa. That's long-term. You see the cattle sector, demand for beef and whatnot continuing to grow, not just because RFK Jr. reversed the food pyramid, but around the world. And so livestock is going to be a continued growth. When you see that's one of the reasons why the South Americans were so keen on getting their trade agreement going forward. So it's going to be Asia over the near term. It's going to be Africa over the long term. And it's going to be high-end, especially beef and other specialized agricultural products continuing to grow. That's what I see. And I see continued demand. Even as population growth is slowing, if you were to take a chart with average calorie intake around the world, it would be a much steeper climb, because a lot of poor countries where calorie intake was relatively low, we're going to see an increase in demand going forward in those countries. And so that's a real opportunity. We have long-term opportunities for agriculture here in this country to grow.
From time to time, I hear people say, oh, there's new technology, so that means fewer jobs. And I've hated to hear that for years, because to me that's somebody who doesn't see the big picture, is not a visionary. Would you care to comment on that, please?
Sure. Well, if you look at, for example, the number of jobs that exist today, 60% of them didn't exist in 1940. So it's not jobs disappear, but new jobs are created as technology comes along. So the question is obviously, AI is undoubtedly going to replace certain jobs, just like previous technologies did with others. Remember, 90% of us worked in agriculture 250 years ago, as we celebrate our 250th anniversary as a country. We clearly don't today. So jobs are going to disappear. There's no way around that. The question is, what jobs are going to replace it? And that's a big question. And this one is particularly difficult to answer, because we just don't know exactly what the labor force is going to look like. When you had an industrial revolution start, it was obvious that factory jobs were going to be the thing of the future, and that's what happened. But as we are now in a technological revolution, it's very unclear. I tell young people, you have to have people skills, that if you're looking for a job, because just sitting behind your computer and being an economist like me doesn't work, right? And you need to have the ability to sell, to advise, to consult. That's extremely important. Jobs with the hands are going to be in place for a long time, right? The robots are going to get better eventually and probably do our plumbing, but not in our lifetime, hopefully. And so it's a lot of people skills. It's going to be a lot of creativity. It's going to be a lot of handwork. Those are the jobs that are safe. And then what are the jobs of the future? Over the near term, AI is not fully automated yet. It's still being able to use AI. If you have AI skills now and you're looking for a job, it's a great opportunity. Eventually, some of that may be replaced. But the big question is, what is coming further down the road? And it's very difficult to answer. And I've looked up many articles from experts on technology to answer that, and nobody has an answer. Right. Nobody does. It's not as clear of a path as we had in the past. So it's really difficult to see the job market of 2040 or the job market of 2050. What is it going to look like? Some of the same jobs are going to be in place. We'll still be meeting here for the 43rd annual Groundhog Day. Hope to see many of you there. But it's going to be a completely different job market than what we have now.
You mentioned Chinese cars, and it seems like they've pulled off what Japan did, in the 80s, without, protectionist tariffs and policies, what do you think the outlook is for, American car manufacturers?
Well, they did it through intellectual property theft, basically. When a Chinese, I worked in the automotive industry and did a lot of work with automotive companies, especially them investing in places like China. The rule was, especially in the 80s and 90s, when you were investing as a car company in China, you had to have 2 domestic joint venture partners. And those joint venture partners had full access to your technology. So Volkswagen went in big, GM went in big, some others did, and the Chinese learned. And they learned extremely well. And what they've done is when Japan caught the break when you had 1973, 74, the oil crisis, Japanese cars were reliable and very fuel efficient. So the market was waiting. And China said, we're going to go all in on EVs because we know in many parts of the world that's the trend. And they have. And they create some fantastic, I've driven some. They're really interesting cars. They're incredibly, they're loaded with tech. The style is really good. The quality's gotten incredibly better. And they look really nice. So they are attracting consumers. They have great batteries. They have great tech. Quality is good. And so here in the US, the risk is that our automotive industry is going to be almost a single market automotive industry, because our market, even before this, was unique. We have the big SUVs and the pickup trucks. You don't see that in most of the rest of the world. So our market is quite unique in an automotive standpoint from the rest of the world. And now at the EV break, where our EV sales have flatlined and the rest of the world have gone up, we're seeing that double down. So I have to be careful because some of the big automotive companies are my clients, but they are in a serious predicament at the moment. They are protected in one way because the market is unique, protected from Chinese competition and whatnot. But on the other hand, their ability to expand outside of the US is quite limited because of that, because their products and their strengths don't align with other markets. China is a concern for Europe. It's a concern for the rest of Asia. It's a concern even now in Canada because they're coming in with their EVs. Especially young people want to drive EVs, and they have some of the best on the market. And I forget what's the name of it. It looks exactly like a Porsche, and its performance is amazing. With the Zhong, I forget the name, sorry, but it costs $55,000, and it has the performance of a 911. This is what's coming, and I think our automotive industry, and they're aware of it clearly, is on the back foot.
So I've been a part of the Tuscarawas County Real Estate Investors Association, which is just a small group of rental operators. This area, there was actually a housing study done. There's a shortage of housing. So I'll boil this down for you. As an economist, would you invest in, say, some duplexes, triplexes, apartment buildings, or would you just put your money in gold?
It's interesting you say that. I'm working on, gold's not a bad investment still, even though the price is high. I'm working on a demographic study for Medina County at the moment, and they have the same problem. And you have these markets where you want your population to grow, but it's at the same time it's an aging population. And a lot of people as you get older want to downsize, and they don't really have the opportunities to because there's not the available housing in place. Same time, if you want to attract young workers, sometimes they just want to have a small place before they have a family. You don't have the products in place. So I think there's a real investment opportunity for those type of houses that you mentioned because the demand is there. You're going to have an older population that wants to downsize, and they want to live still close to where they grew up, where they raised their family. You want to attract young people to build your economy. So I think there's a real opportunity, especially in counties like Tuscarawas County, to invest in that type of property. The thing I'm learning as I do this with Medina County is there's a lot of resistance to it. Not so much in the cities themselves, but in the townships, where there's a real desire to keep it rural, put big, minimum lot sizes of 5 acres and up, or whatever it may be. And so there's a resistance to it. But from an economic standpoint, it makes every sense in the world, because there will be demand from people who want to stay in their home community but don't want to have a big house to take care of, from young people who want to start a life in that community, have a new job in that community. Yep.
Other question?
A lot of questions today. No Browns
Probably
questions.
need to be the last one.
Oh, we're fine. My voice is still there. I'm good.
Do you ever see, and I guess over what period of time, the declining population catching up to the need for housing? Like, at what point do you put too many rentals on the market?
Yeah. Well, that's where China is now. That's why China has their huge real estate problem, is they built so much housing. And governments were given free money, basically, from the central government, regional governments were, and they just built housing everywhere. And they have cities that could hold 500,000 people that are empty. So that's the perfect example of what happens when you have too much housing. The problem we're going to have is what I just mentioned, mismatched housing. Like, we're going to have this big housing stock with big houses and big yards, but the market isn't looking for that as much anymore. You have older people looking to downsize. You have young people looking for a starter place to go with smaller families than we used to have. So the housing market is not going to match. So I think you're going to have a lot of excess housing that's unused, which we see in a lot of cities where population has come down a lot. But at the same time, there's still going to be demand for new types of housing for this new demographic situation we have. But China, look up some of these cities in China, it's incredible. Like, you have big, giant apartment buildings and city centers, and there's nobody there because they just built for a population that was shrinking dramatically already. And like I said, they shrank by 3.4 million last year. So exactly. It's those communities that can plan their housing markets right, that have the markets in place for their aging population, plus their attempts to bring in younger people with smaller families, that are going to have a real opportunity economically to succeed.
Anybody else have to ask one more?
And you can reach me on my email if there's any questions you have that you don't think of today.
I will send out the presentation. As long as you're registered, I've got your email. If you don't get it by this afternoon, sometimes I notice with bigger companies, particularly, mass emails bounce back a lot. So if you don't get it by the afternoon, just shoot me I'll send you one individually. But let's give Michael a round of applause. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right.
Thanks.
Sir. Appreciate it. Okay. Have a wonderful week. Stay warm.